right, map monsters and creepy curiosities. I'm Sammy Berk. This is New World Cartographic. Welcome. So before we start to get into it, we always have to ask the question, what is it that makes a monster? Today it's often used to describe something otherwise unreal, or it could be someone that does something horrible, something monstrous. It's generally never anything good. Other synonyms that we would include would be hideous, frightful, or revolting. What history has seemed to tell us about monsters is that they often stem from misconceptions or things that are just not understood. Even if we look back into the early 1900s, there were circuses that had freak shows. And a lot of the freaks or people that would be in those shows would be described as monstrous or other adjectives that go along, they're synonymous with monstrous. But oftentimes, they were always generally people, just like us, with certain conditions that were just misunderstood. So oftentimes it's misconceptions, misunderstanding, just unknowing of the real world. Contra naturam, Latin for against nature. So again, we go back to unreal, things that shouldn't be. Other biblical texts would describe it as an adornment of the universe that can teach humanity about the dangers of sin. First thing that came to mind for me, gluttony. This is the cutest monster you will see during this talk, I promise. But in ancient times, some of these were born out of myths or other religious beliefs. A typical formula that you would need for creating a monster would be to combine elements of different animals together into one beast, or you would combine those parts with that of a human. We think of things like centaurs, which would be somewhat, if you were to see that, you would describe that as monstrous, certainly, but it was often found in lots of Greek mythology. Let's see if this is working. Hey, all right. Be thy animal or beast. As was often the case, many medieval maps infrequently see sea creatures, especially those large in size, are misrepresented as monsters. So you think of hundreds of years ago, some of the earliest ships that were setting sail, and the crew that was on some of these ships, what would they see? And what was their previous life experience before seeing such things like that? And then how can they explain what they had seen? So oftentimes you would have, what we find in some maps is that you see depictions that could be whales, sharks, walruses, things like giant squid and octopus. There's actually a monster that we used. It is in some of these maps in the show, but we used it for some of the promo material as for promoting this event. It was a giant lobster with a man in its claw. And that was actually born out of a story of somebody seeing a giant squid. But if you ever played the game Telephone, sometimes stories from one to the other start to take on new elements that are not always quite what they were at the beginning, which is how we arrived at a giant lobster. So we look at this. In this map, balena, it basically means whale. And if you look at the smaller one, it says orca. And then you look at the attributes of it. The pointed dorsal fin is very similar to what one would see if they saw an orca swimming. And obviously it's got teeth. The balena could be any other type of whale, possibly a sperm whale, something with teeth. But baleen is often used. It's part of a whale, but it's not teeth. It's more of a string, or I don't know I guess you would just call it baleen. They're filter feeders. But if you were a sailor, if you were out at sea and you saw this, you wouldn't necessarily think initially filter feed, and you see that and you think large teeth. And so that's where we start to get some of these creatures. All right, early appearance of monsters. So there's a great quote, "So vulgar the notion may be true that anything which is produced in any other departments of nature may be found in the sea as well." So a lot of the early monsters that we tend to find were part land animal, part sea creature. So here goes back into the Baths of Neptune, 2nd century AD, mosaic of a half lion, half fish. Guess you could call it a lionfish. But in this case, it was one of those areas where they combined an animal of the land with that which you would find at sea. Like we said, you find it in a lot of mythology. So Thetis seated on a hippocampus with a spear and shield of Achilles. This is taken from a mosaic from 400 to 350 BC. So this is much, much earlier than a lot of the map monsters that we will eventually get into. But you can see that these sort of ideas have been present for quite a long time. And notice you have the part horse, part, I guess you would call it sea serpent by the long tail. Take note of that combination because you will see it later on. Here we have a mosaic with Katos and its sea creature, which essentially this resembles almost more of a dragon. But again, this is supposed to be something that would be found at sea. So notice a lot of these happen at sea. And a lot of what we find with monsters is that which is misunderstood or cannot be explained. And certainly in this time of the world and even later, they knew that the world was much larger than what they could see or what they could know or what they knew, and such beasts must be hidden from them in the far reaches of the world. So we're going to start to get into the maps, but before we do, I think it's best to describe the earliest printed world map. This is known as the TO map, and basically what you have is a circle, which represents the world's oceans. You have that's the O, and then you have the T in the middle. And the T represents the Tanis and Nile rivers and the Mediterranean. As you can see, you have Europe, then Africa, then Asia. Now, notice that north is not at the top. This is a very common theme with a lot of early maps. There was never really an initial reason to put north at the top in the early days of map making. Now, this map would not be used to find your way from around Europe, obviously. It was more of a thematic sort of map. And oftentimes what it did was it placed Jerusalem, or the Holy Land, at the center of the world. Now, this could be part for two reasons. One, these maps were found in a lot of early biblical texts, which the Holy Land was believed to be the center of the world. But also when you think of what was known, early travelers were more often by land than at sea. And if they were by sea, they weren't always going on transoceanic voyages at this time. So the world was basically what they had known. And since they had never been around Africa, they just assumed the ocean goes all the way around, which they are correct. But we will see other maps where there are other land masses in there that aren't there, like this one. So you notice this is another TO map. You've got the T with the Mediterranean going right up the top, the rivers across, and the world's oceans. If you look at where Jerusalem would be, you see both Mount Sinai and you see Adam and Eve, which is supposed to be in the Garden of Eden, which was believed early to be in Mesopotamia. Now we get into the oceans of this map. We have kind of a sea chicken, as you can see towards the bottom, and this continues with that combination of land and sea creatures found in maps. And then here we have a man within the belly of a whale. And I think a lot of us can figure out where that basically comes from, the biblical story of Jonah and the whale. But these are some of the earliest monsters to be found. These are some of the first monsters to be found in any maps. Now, a lot of times, as I mentioned, things that we don't understand must come from places of the unknown. And a lot of early maps place monsters in the southern hemisphere. Not just monsters, but other things that might be wretched or horrible. So here is the bottom portion of a map by Petrus Appianus, circa 1544, 1553, depending on the printed edition that it came out of. Notice here, the next slide we'll see the full map, but I wanted to zoom in here because you notice these there are these skulls at the bottom. In early maps of the 16th century, you had a lot of wind heads, these kind of godlike heads that were supposed to be blowing the winds that would fill the sails that would move man around the world. So you have these wind heads here, but they're not the wind heads in the traditional sense. They're more deathly. And that was based on this early belief that that disease, which is unknown, just like monsters, must come from faraway places. Those faraway places was the south, the southern poles of the world. Other things that we see in here, it's a little blurry, but you see in the Americas, it says cannibals up around Brazil. And we will get into that later. But there's some sea creatures spotted around the southern portion. Now we get to the full view of the map, and you can see the wind heads around the top. They're far different from the ones at the bottom. And again, that lends itself to the idea that a lot of the monsters you see, the plague you see, it comes from far away, it comes from the south. Other interesting cartographic thing to note is North America. As you can see it right there. I wish I had a laser pointer. But it's a long strip of land, and you can't read it, but if you look, you'll see the map on the wall. It says Bacalarium, and that basically references good cod fishing. Has nothing to do with monsters, but an interesting piece in this map that I figured I should point out. So we'll continue with these locational origins in the lower portions. Sebastien Munster. I don't know why we would get this. All right. This is, again, in the Southern Sea, a massive fish. And then we have what is depicted as, that's actually a siren, which was another danger to sailors. They were supposed to be beautiful and sing great songs, which would guide ships off course and often into dangers. Does anyone recognize that kind of figure there from something you see in everyday life? Exactly. I figured we have somebody that would get that one. Yep. The siren that sells you coffee. Lures you in with temptation. So this is the larger image of that map. Again, you see you've got the land up north, you've got place names. It's not exact at this time, as most maps weren't, but another reason sometimes why you would see monsters filled in the oceans is this fear that map makers had of empty space in their maps. So sometimes they would also fill it with monsters. But at this time, such things were believed to come from the far reaches of the world. But this is a map by Olaus Magnus. And I'm just trying to find my notes here. Basically, he was Swedish, and he went to Venice in the mid-16th century. At the time, Venice, Italy was kind of the hub for map making. Any explorers that came back with notes, they would find the map makers there, which would produce a lot of maps. And so Olaus went down there, and he created this map. This is actually the earliest map of Scandinavia to have detail in terms of place names. But what you can't fail to notice, especially in the top left, is just the plethora of sea creatures and monsters within those. We have other slides where we'll see them in detail. But one of the theories, actually, it's a fun, interesting theory as to why we find monsters in these northern reaches, especially from somebody that made the map that was from this region that should have understood a lot of the things that they saw at sea. One of the theories is that they had great fishing up there. And they didn't want the Europeans from the south to come up and start fishing in their waters. So it's a great way to perpetuate myths and stories of things like a giant serpent that would devour a crew, which we will get into right now. All right, so first we have Zipiasts, a horrible sea monster that swallows black seals in one bite, potentially a killer whale. His horrible eyes, a sharp beak like a sword, and a triangular back, also possibly the fin of a killer whale. And it was a stranger in the north. So there are a couple things in here that could fit, some things that don't. The beak can be odd. It was often described that it had the face of an owl. Here, this is a great picture, one of my favorite early stories of sea monsters. You can see a ship here is anchored onto one of these monsters, and there's two men lighting a fire on top of it. So this stems from a whale mistaken for an island, from the stories of St. Brendan. And it was said that they were at sea for a while, and they found land, decided to anchor and cook food, and all of a sudden, the land went under the sea, and it turned out there wasn't an island at all. It was a massive whale. True story? I don't know. I wasn't there, but we can have our assumptions. Last one, the Serpent, which we mentioned before. Enormous sea serpent attacking a large ship. And this comes from unanimous testimony of Norwegians that would describe it as being 200 feet long and 200 feet thick. But it was said to have reared itself high like a pillar and devour crew. When it wasn't devouring crew, it would pick off animals from the land. It was believed to live in caves along the land and come out to, and it often was believed to feed on animals that came close to the sea. But then every now and then it would have a snack with a ship passing by. So these are all out of Olaus Magnus's map from 1537. So here we have Icelandia, which we have up on the wall here. Abraham Ortelius, 1585. So Iceland has always been an island of wonder. If anyone has ever been there, I've never been there. I'm saving up, but they have lakes that are crystal blue yet 95 degrees, and sulfur springs, and it's just a very odd place, geologically speaking, and it's in the far reaches of. Again, it's in the north, like much of Europe, but it was still far away. So it was a great place to put some monsters that was hard to disprove. So here we have, this is described as a narwhal. Fish commonly called a narwhal that has a long horn that is thought to be a good antidote and powerful medicine against poison. Also in Ortelius's map is this sea hog. Other maps depict it as a sea hyena. If you notice on its side, it's got 3 eyes. So the sea hog, the head of a boar, webbed feet, a row of uneven spines or bristles on its back, and 3 eyes on its side, supposedly sighted in the German Sea in 1537. So again, this based on an account from a sighting. The validity of it is unknown. I guess one can dive into that a little bit deeper. And then here we have the seahorse, which we saw earlier. Seahorse with a long mane, webbed front feet, a long spiny tail is said to have been a horrible monster that hunted and killed many fishermen. So here we have these sometimes described as vaca marina, or sea cows. Not manatees, but they were known to come from the sea and go onto the land, and they were believed to have some sort of bag under their nose that helped them live in the water, and when that bag would break, they would then stay on the land, which is why you would see cows or bulls without a bag under their nose. So I guess that's proof that they could be in the sea. But here in this depiction, they have them both on sea, or in sea and on land, but and when they're in the ocean, they're close to shore. Here we have a fun sea monster, the massive fish covered with bristles, bones, like a shark, much larger, and when it appears, it looks like an island, lays flat, and as ships would come near, it was believed to use those fins to overturn ships and likely devour the crew, because what fun is it if the crew's not being devoured? Now, not a monster at all, but going back to the Curiosities of Iceland, it's hard to read this, but basically this is Latin text, in which one says springs that will change white wool black, and another is a spring that will change black wool white. Must be how they described having black and white sheep in that region. Then we have another lake, which it's difficult to translate Old Latin, but from what I got from it, it describes a large lake with a shape-shifting serpent that was known to terrorize the locals of the island. So again, it's just an incredible map that obviously has lots of images, but as with most maps, what I always encourage people to do is you can look at a map and look at it for its beauty up front, but the real fun is when you start to dive in and look at all the little text, the little place names, and read them, and then start to dive down that rabbit hole and find why was that there, what does it say, and what is that based on? And you could spend a couple months just on one map. And so now we are going to begin to venture out of the animal monsters and kind of get more into the human element of it, or what we kind of describe as curiosities. So oftentimes Curiosities can sometimes be synonymous with monsters, but they tend to relate more to the human form. I'm going to look at this map here by Hartman Shadle. It was made in 1493 is when it was printed, when it was published. So the work that went into it was being done at the time when Columbus was, right around the time when he was discovering America, which what he believed to be Asia. So cartographically, what we have here is Europe up in the top left, Asia to the right, Africa, and then you can see there's a landmass that kind of encapsulates the Indian Ocean. And that was basically there because nobody had been around the southern tip of Africa at the time. So this could have been based on assumption or earlier reports. But what's really interesting is these kind of humanoid creatures that we find here. And what we're looking at is essentially a pre-Columbian, and I call it it's really exactly at the time Columbus discovered America, but it's a view of the world and its inhabitants from far reaches. So like I said, before we had these transoceanic explorers, we did have people that traveled to different regions by land. And some of the things they saw and they wrote down could be described as monstrous. So this map includes several humanoid creatures which are rumored to inhabit the far-known reaches of the world. And there was kind of a, it's hard to say if it was a deliberate push to dehumanize people from other parts of the world by, but we will begin to look a little bit closer at some of these creatures here, the Curiosities of Shadle, as I like to call them. So here we have Cynocephalus, or the dog-headed man with a human body. We have a Cyclops, which stems from ancient Greek and Roman mythology. And we have the Blummies, which were people with no head, but a face on their chest. And we actually find this in several different books. What we're going to find is that some of these are born out of mythology, some who knows what, and some just out of different tribes and what you would see if you really ventured out into the interior of Africa or India or parts of Asia in the 15th century. Here we have someone likely suffering from elephantitis, but according to Gaius Solinus, 3rd century AD, it was believed that he used their giant foot as a parasol to shield them from the sun. But if we look at actually, accounts of this elephantitis, and bear in mind, this is the most appealing picture of elephantitis that I was able to find to go along with this image here. And I also just thought it was interesting, the seated position, and you could see where this kind of image was derived from. Again, we go into cultural differences in beauty. So, here we have different tribes in Africa that will have the elongated lip ring, or other tribes that would elongate their ears. Again, this stems from early accounts of explorers and what they saw and the way that they're represented here. Again, it's, to people in Europe, they would see this and say, what kind of, this can't be pure human, this must be something else. So really dehumanizing factor. Here we have a man with a long neck, kind of doing a Fonzie point, interestingly, and a beak. And where I think this comes from, I was actually thinking the Kayan Lawi tribe of northern Thailand, the people that elongate their necks with rings. The beak, where that comes from, it's hard to tell, but the elongated neck, when I first saw it, this was the first thing that I've always thought of. And then we have the six-armed man, which, if we look at different elements of Hinduism, especially the many arms dance, this is the same sort of image that you get. Here we have this, like I said, first written Christopher Columbus in a letter from 1493. The account that he had was basically a tribe in Puerto Rico that described other tribes in the Lesser Antilles or islands to the south as warlike people that ate who they captured or ate who they defeated. Second account came soon after. It was said that Nicolas Salasio visited a village in Guadalupe where he found a large number of Indians that were fixed on spits and roasted over hot coals, and they note many bodies missing heads and limbs. And then the idea was further pushed actually by Amerigo Vespucci in a 1504, some say 1505, of a book that he wrote where he shows tribes in Brazil that would, and describes them, that would eat their enemy, and he included a confession of a man that was said to have eaten over 200 bodies. Whether this is true or not is unknown, but basically this is the sort of early images that you would get. So you have basically kind of a butchering post. You would see at the top you have heads and limbs hanging from branches. You've got a couple limbs off to the side, yet you also have a baby suckling on the mother's breast. So there was still some sort of a human element to this. They weren't necessarily trying to push that they were these subhuman creatures or monsters, but just really kind of disgust Europeans with their traditions of eating other people. The man on the spit. So this is the earliest known map to illustrate cannibalism in the New World. The author is anonymous. It's known to be Portuguese. It's a manuscript, which essentially means hand-drawn, manually scripted, from 1506. And here you have the coast of Brazil and an obvious man on a spit being rotated. So,
do you know what kind of seasoning they use?
Herbals, something herbal. So, again, this is sort of, what they were going for was not dehumanizing, but later on when Europeans would begin to plunder the gold and the riches in these areas, if the people in Europe would hear of accounts of mass slaughter of tribes, this is a way of kind of dulling the effect of saying, yes, they were slaughtered, but they would have eaten us if we didn't kill them. These were, people with horrific practices, ungodly practices. So here we have a world map, which this is one of my favorite world maps. It encapsulates a lot of things that we talk about. It's by Sebastien Munster and Hans Holbein, published in 1532. Now, their names do not appear on the map or anywhere around the publication. It is widely believed it was their publication. And this doesn't have anything to do with monsters, but it's very interesting. One of the main reasons why I love this map is that the poles, you can see people with a crank, and they're spinning the earth. And this map actually came out a few years prior to Copernicus releasing his theory that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but within the universe. And the stars do not rotate around us. We spin and we see the stars that are around us. Not a popular belief by the church. You could be getting a lot of trouble if you were found voicing it or publishing it, which is why their names you can't find on this map. But we will get into the top left and lower left portions of this map here. So first we're going to get back into a little bit of monsters. As I said, this map kind of encompasses it all. You have these serpents with bat-like wings, some described as having a beak and feathered wings. These look to be more of the feathered type wings. Seen here, they're eating a ram. You would also have an elephant. It's hard to decide. It could either be, it looks to me like an elephant attacking a human, or possibly there was a human decoy because you have somebody else behind a tree as if they're hunting the elephant. And then here we have our friends with the elongated lips, seen again. This is in the western portion of the map.
Is his leg missing of the guy on the ground?
Yep, looks like it. Yep, that's why he's sitting. Either that or it's just bent underneath. Yeah, he's just relaxing maybe. Perhaps. Yeah, two tribesmen with the lip plates. And this is still common among the Suri and Mursi tribes of Ethiopia. Getting to the bottom portion, and now we're really getting into the cannibalism scene. And this is kind of the whole process, showing the transport of an individual by mule, the dismemberment, and then the cooking, the spit. And then you also have limbs and heads hung up Some believe they may have been trying to. Some saw this as a warning sign. Others thought they may have been drying out limbs or part of the process, the cooking process. Really, a culinary art they might have had. But what we found is that a lot of these maps, and this is another great map with fantastic detail, which we'll get into a couple other images here. Basically, you have the scene again in Brazil of cannibalism. You also have giants of Patagonia. In fact, the word Patagonia kind of stems from large feet. And then down here, you have sirens. And again, all of these are now in the southern portion of South America, so very far away from Europe, continuing with that theme of the far reaches of the world. It was said that the myth of the giants stems from the sailing of Magellan, and that they spent several weeks actually with these giants. It was said that they also tried to bring a few back on their ship, but they died in the process and never made it back. Later, other people would visit there and say the people that live here, there's some that are a little bit bigger, but nothing by the accounts that the people from the Magellan expedition recalled. Eat gold, Christians. That was what was said to have been yelled in this print by Theodore de Bry of 1617. So again, this goes back to the theme of Europeans there plundering the gold and the riches, and here you see a scene of them pouring gold into the mouth of a Spaniard. The limbs in the back. There's a guy gnawing on an arm up there. This is another map or another print that we have in the back. And what we found through history is that a lot of these accounts were strongly exaggerated. A lot of them were not true. I'm sure some of them were, and stories kind of were built upon that. But it is widely believed that these stories and finding cannibals in maps was often there to push the idea of don't worry about what we do to the people when we plunder the land and discover these areas, because they're not people of God. They're not worthy of treatment like normal people. They start to fade away from maps in the latter part of the 17th century. And in the 18th century, you really don't see it at all anymore. However, the idea of it still remained. And a great account of this is the story of Moby Dick and their fear of cannibals. So if anyone's read that epic story, people generally know that the Essex was destroyed by the white whale in 1820, and 20 men survived on 3 lifeboats. Instead, Captain Pollard elected to take the long journey east instead of heading for the Marquesas Islands, which is essentially French Polynesia, over fear of cannibalism. So this is 1820, and by this time, cannibalism had long been erased from the maps, but the fear still remained. The irony of it all is that by February, they had begun eating each other. They had been at sea for months, and that was the way to survive. There was one ship where they were said to have essentially draw straws, and one of them was actually just killed on the boat to be eaten so the rest could survive. Another account that they just ate them as they passed. But essentially this is where we'll lead off, in that it's the misconceptions of monsters and people and practices that can lead to very unfortunate consequences and bad decisions, as here with Moby Dick. And basically what we've covered, we've started from a couple hundred years BC to now 1820. And now we're really at a point where there's not much that we don't understand. So you kind of really have to relish the time we live in now and realize the hundreds of years of map monsters, oddities, curiosities that we find, which were basically born out of misconceptions of the real world. And I believe that is our lecture. Thank you.